Now, I reckon it's fair to say that the term game changer might be overused nowadays, especially on YouTube, but I think that could genuinely be what we have on our hands today from Honda. You see, they've just announced the full details of the CB1000 Hornet that we already knew vaguely about from last year, but on top of that, they've included an SP model which is dripping in top spec goodies. But there is one thing that absolutely defines this announcement and really did come as a surprise to me. And so here we go with absolutely everything that you need to know about them. Before we get started though, a massive thanks to Caloto for supporting the channel and sponsoring this video. Caloto is a brilliant motorcycle navigation app with its own dedicated algorithm to seek out the best roads, and so you never have to ride a boring road again. It's perfect for exploring new areas where you might not know the roads on a tour, for example. But I also love using it for mixing up my local routes and finding new combinations. Genuinely, I love using Caloto out on my bike, and so I'd thoroughly recommend checking out the links in the description. And also down there you'll find a couple of codes, one for a free trial and also one for a discount if you do decide to take out one of their premium memberships. Now let's start with this base bike, which like I say we already knew about because it was unveiled at EICMA in 2023, but they only gave a brief overview of the details until today. Effectively, you can see this as a follow-on from the CB1000R with a similar inline-4 engine that's derived from a previous generation of the Fireblade. And also, a lot of the chassis is similar, with similar suspension, similar brakes, and also similar tech too. Perhaps the most apparent change though is the visual redesign, with a move away from the Neo Sports Cafe design language that they used on the CB1000R and some of the other smaller nakeds as well, like the 650 and the 300 and the 125. This one goes more so towards a modern and angular design, and I think if we're being honest, especially in this red finish, it certainly has a hint of Ducati Street Fighter about the front end. Thing is though, look beneath the visuals and you'll spot some more structural changes, like the double-sided swing arm in place of the single-sider on the CB1000R, and also some much simpler wheels too. Basically, this is all in the name of cutting the cost of production down so they can offer this bike at a more competitive price point, and it absolutely makes sense because the CB1000R always seemed to get compared to like super nakeds and it always came up short. It was plenty of horsepower down, and also the spec was a little bit basic, like Nissin brakes instead of the Brembos on some of the more premium bikes, and so it really did feel like their 1000 naked needed a bit of a repositioning. That's exactly what they've done, and we'll get onto the SP model in a moment, which is really quite something as well. But here's the thing with this CB1000 Hornet base bike is that the starting price for 2025 is just under £9,000, which I think is phenomenal value for money, and also really clearly differentiates it from that top-end, super expensive part of the market. When I read that price, I even replied to Honda saying, "Are you sure you've got this right? Is that a typo? I really want to check before I make this video." Because if you think about what you'd pay elsewhere for 150 horsepower naked with an inline 4, it'd be nowhere near sub 10 grand, let alone sub 9 grand. This is effectively as well what Honda did with the middleweight market a couple of years back when they launched the 750 version of the Hornet, and it came in at £6,995. That was less than pretty much all the competition at the time, some of which was looking a little long in the tooth and starting to look a bit basic, and yet it did all this with more power, better chassis components, more techie features, and it really did feel like a bit of a reset for what you could get for your money in that part of the market. Now for me, the benchmark in the naked category in terms of thrills per pound spent, if you're looking at a more serious bike, well, it has to be the Yamaha MT-09 with its brilliant 120 horsepower triple, a super fun chassis, striking looks, the R1 derived tech, and even that bike now has gone over £10,000 this year, so it's 10,106. Now look, we've got no idea as to whether a CB1000 Hornet is going to be anywhere near as good as an MT-09 out on the road, but at least on paper, It certainly looks like a bike that's going to make it onto a lot of people's absolutely must test ride list if they're looking for a sports naked in 2025. An inline 4 is always going to be a big selling point for a lot of riders, especially in that sort of sporty segment, and this one makes almost exactly 150 horsepower up at 11,000 RPM. Now clearly, from a 1000cc inline 4, more peak power is possible, but the whole point of this engine is they've also tuned it for like a usable mid-range out on the road, and so you get 104 Newton meters of peak torque at 9,000 RPM. Then you've got a new steel frame at the heart of it, which they say has been developed to optimize torsional rigidity, and is suspended on a 41mm Showa separate function upside down fork, a Showa ProLink shock at the rear, and both of these offer full adjustability. Now, like I say, brakes are from Nissin with the 4-piston radially mounted caliper up front on 3 10mm discs. And really, the only shortcoming I can spot on the spec sheet for this bike is potentially the weight. Certainly versus something like an MT-09, 211 kilograms wet does sound a bit hefty. It's about 22 kilograms more. But look, I think a lot of people will absolutely tolerate that. It's still not particularly heavy. And then when you consider the price and the fact that it makes loads of power, I highly doubt this is going to feel anything like sluggish. Almost certainly though, the hotter seller out of the two models is going to be the SP version, which, like I say, came as a bit of a surprise. There was no indication that this one was coming, and this one gets even more power and torque, yet at the same point in the rev range, with 155 horsepower made at the same 11,000 RPM and 107 Newton meters of peak torque at 9,000 RPM. Apparently this is entirely down to the fact that they fitted this version with a valve in the exhaust system, and so it's fully closed under 5,700 RPM to emphasize, I guess, low-end torque and keep the sort of noise levels down. But as soon as you open it up and get above that point in the rev range, it'll fully open, and that's going to allow the engine to breathe that bit freer. Now, the rest of the engine is identical to the CB1000 Hornet base bike, although you do get the 3-level adjustable quick shifter fitted as standard, which you'd have to spec up as an accessory at your own cost otherwise. Tech, I believe, is pretty much the same between the two bikes, so there's 3 levels of engine power, 3 levels of engine braking, 4 levels of traction control, and 3 standard riding modes of range, standard and sport, as well as user modes 1 and 2, so you can dial in your own settings, and also the dash on both bikes is a TFT, and you can hook it up to your phone through the connectivity feature, which is standard on both bikes, so you can control your music and whatnot. In terms of the chassis though, there are more points of differentiation, and that's with the hardware. And so although the frame and fork I believe are exactly the same, there's actually at the rear an Öhlins TTX 36 shock fitted as standard, which should give you a bit of an improvement in ride quality. On top of that, you've got a remote preload adjuster, so a little bit of extra convenience there as well. And the brakes are also bumped in spec, with Brembo's Stylema 4-piston radial calipers replacing the Nissins of that standard bike. Now, the base model comes in either white, silver or red, but naturally, being an SP model, it's a little bit more fancy, with this nice stealthy black finish that gets some pops of gold with the graphics, along with the gold wheels, which I think finish it off really quite nicely. Now, I think you quite rightly expect to pay quite a bit more for this bike, but it still comes in at £9,999, so just £1,000 more than the standard bike. For the valve in the exhaust, the quick shifter, the Öhlins shock, the Brembo brakes, the slightly fancy paint job, I think that's really quite reasonable. And again, as far as I'm aware, this level of spec and performance at this price point is pretty much unmatched nowadays. And I will say, generally, I think when Honda moved away from not this previous generation CB1000R, but the CB1000 before that, to the Neo Sports Cafe design language, which is a bit minimalist and modern and has the round headlight and stuff like that, I think quite a lot of people were disappointed, and a lot of people I've seen in comments and forums and stuff like that preferred the older version. It kind of feels like to me they've tried to go back to that sort of vibe, because I'd say it's got much more in common with that previous CB1000 than it does with the more recent CB1000R. But look, styling jobs are subjective, so I'd love to know what you think down in the comments and whether it's an improvement or if you think they've made it worse. Even if though it's not your cup of tea, I think you've got to take your hat off to Honda here for delivering something that really does look like crazy value for money, especially at a time when it seems like motorcycles are getting getting more and more expensive as people, I guess, are expected to finance them. £20,000 bikes are not unusual now, and in fact in some parts of the market, like the large capacity adventure bikes or certainly some of the super nakeds, well, it seems to have become the norm, and yet at the same time people are feeling the pinch, the cost of living's up, and so maybe this is exactly what people need right now to go and have some fun without having to take out a massive loan. Question is though, can any other manufacturer deliver this sort of value in order to compete with Honda? Like I say, it's already cheaper than an MT-09, and the MT-09 SP, which you could consider more of a competitor for this SP version, well, that's over 11,800 in 2024, and so maybe it'll be even higher when Yamaha's 2025 pricing is announced, so that's going to be like a $2,000 difference. A Kawasaki Z900 starts at 9,699, that's a much more basic bike, and I think Suzuki's GSX S1000 realistically has to be the closest competition for this bike. Well, that's $12,000, and it doesn't have all the fancy bits like the SP. Honda are, by far and away, the biggest motorcycle manufacturer on the planet, and of course they're part of an even bigger automotive company, and so I just don't know if any other manufacturers can operate at that sort of scale, where it means they can afford to take a much lower margin, I guess, on each of their bikes. For me, so far this is one of the biggest announcements of the year so far, purely based upon that price, but as always, I'd love to know what you think of it, so do let me know down in the comments below. Also, if 1000cc seems a little bit serious for you, then maybe the 750 Hornet's more your cup of tea, in which case I'll leave my review of it on the screen now so you can give it a watch in case you haven't already. Also, do hit subscribe if you want to see more of the latest motorcycle news like this, all the big bike announcements right here on MOTOBOB. A massive thanks for watching today, and we'll see you in the next video.